Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 49 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another episode today. Before we jump in, a few quick reminders. If you want your own true crime story read on the podcast, maybe a murder from your hometown, maybe a robbery you saw, maybe a time you almost got kidnapped, write them to thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com with the subject of listener files, and they could be read on the bonus content that will roll out this fall. Also, if you are interested in getting bonus content from me in various categories, including true stories from listeners, assassinations, and some horrific natural disasters, then get ready to sign up, pay a few bucks a month, and receive some bonus content from me. Also, we will be doing a merch giveaway as well. Please don't forget to take a second to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen. This is the absolute best way to help support TheKillFile so that we can get the word out there about our community. Also, don't be afraid to engage in the social media posts. I read them. So comment, ask questions, clarify, or share your own knowledge on a case. I love that because I am only one person. I can't find everything out there about every single case, and I love to learn more about the cases that we talk about. Don't forget to hit that download button on this episode to let us know how many listeners we have and to be able to listen anywhere, including places without Wi-Fi. Last thing before we jump in is a reminder to check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can read a little bit more about me and how TheKillFile got started. And you can find the merch link for some fun true crime merch, some comfy clothes, and fun odds and ends. You can also suggest a case right there on the website. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today's case is about a Russian serial killer that is probably one of the worst we have covered. So, fair warning, today's case is not for the faint of heart. Today we are going to be talking about Andrei Chikatilo, aka the Rostov Ripper, aka the Red Ripper, and to some known as the Butcher of Rostov. After completing the research for this case and scripting out upwards of 20 pages, I decided to go ahead and split this case into two parts so that we aren't left here just sick to our stomachs after a long-ass episode with heinous acts. The first part, we will cover a lot of the background into Andrei Chikatilo and a little of his crimes and victims. The second part will focus heavily on his crimes and then cover how he was caught, etc. Trigger warnings for today are going to be brutality on a minor, rape of a minor, sexual assault on a minor, murder, cannibalism, talks of suicide, and all-around horrificness because, hi, this is TheKillFile and this is what we do. Also, let me just apologize now for butchering the names and places because they're in Russian, and while I started looking them all up in the beginning, it got to the point where I just couldn't anymore, guys. There were just too many. So I did my best to look into some of the bigger stuff, but I don't mean any disrespect to any victims or their families by being an uncultured dumbass and trying to put a Spanish accent to everything because it's the only one I'm good at. Here we go. I'm going to start by setting the scene a little and sharing a little knowledge of the area that Andrei Chikatilo grew up in because I think this kind of environment may have helped shape the person that he would end up being with such an awful environment. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936 in Yablukhin, Ukraine. In this time, the Ukraine was still recovering from all of the havoc caused by Joseph Stalin. And part of the havoc was horrific famine in this area where it would be dubbed, quote unquote, death by hunger or Holodomor. Sorry if I butchered that. People in this area were desperate to stay alive without anything to eat as their grains were being taken from them. The unspeakable and quite maybe embarrassing things that people had to do to stay alive were undoubtedly traumatic and haunting to say the least. We will hear an example of the living conditions and those acts from a living witness to them. During this time, Nazi Germany had invaded the Ukraine on the orders of something called Operation Barbarossa. The Luftwaffe, which was or is basically the German Air Force, was known to have bombed the area where Andrei grew up, and he would later say that it actually became his normal everyday life to have witnessed people being shot and having to hide from different soldiers. The famine at this time was so severe that one person who lived through it and was a witness to some horrific events named Maria Andreevna, who had been born in August of 1922 and was living in a village called Kostiantinivka. People were being forced to be a part of collective farming fields. So there were Soviet activists who would come in and take away the grain and seeds, harvesting them, leaving the people with nothing. When the people would go to the fields looking for anything left over from the harvest because they were starving, Maria said anyone from adult to children could be shot or killed or imprisoned if they were caught taking anything from the collective fields, because it could be considered stealing quote-unquote socialist property. The people were left with nothing to eat in the winters and nothing to plant in the springtime. People at first had resorted to eating all types of livestock, and then following out of that desperation, people turned to eating cats, dogs, and any other animals they could get their hands on. Maria would say that she was a part of the people who had started to realize that chicken excrement had grains of wheat in it. They knew that the feces were toxic, so they would collect the excrement and boil it. Apparently, the feces contained something called saltpeter, which can cause acute poisoning. After they boiled them, they would eat however much they could feast on, and then Maria said that they would be intoxicated for the next 2 days. However, they didn't die, she said. She then went on to talk about how many people were so desperate for food that one older woman that she knew actually ate her own baby. She went on to say, quote, "The woman was old, but she did eat her baby. That's how it was in 1933. It stays forever with you. It is ingrained in my mind forever. The woman survived, but she didn't live long." End quote. Maria would tell tales of how people would just die of hunger out in the streets, and they were sadly just thrown into pits, and then soil was thrown on top of them. No one in the area was given any sort of proper burial. In one village during the period of just 1 year, 223 citizens of the village died from starvation, and it is believed that that number is actually higher. People would try to eat the roots and herbs of plants, which would actually lead to a lot of food poisoning. When parents of children would die, the children would be left to wander the streets unprotected and looking for food. There were also many cases of parents who were so desperate to save their children that they would put them on trains that were headed to different cities in hopes that someone would find them and take care of them. Some of them just babies. Sadly, most of the children would die from the cold or from thirst because they would have to spend days or weeks without someone looking out for them. Consuming human flesh would become somewhat of a common occurrence. People were being kidnapped and murdered for cannibalism, and of course, bodies were also being stolen from the local cemeteries. In just 1 year in Ukraine, 2,500 people were convicted of cannibalism, and those were just the ones who were caught. When people were caught cannibalizing other people, sometimes they would just be beaten to death by a crowd, or sometimes they would be burned alive. Apparently, the smell of cooking flesh or cannibalism was easy to detect, so it got to the point that people had to resort to eating human flesh cold. I think it just speaks to the horrific conditions that these people were forced to live in. I know that to us, cannibalism is gross and unthinkable, but I can imagine that when you go that long without food, that it doesn't seem that crazy. I can imagine being a mother and having children to feed and with nothing and being desperate. It's so sad because I'm sure these people didn't want to or enjoy eating other people, with maybe your 1 or 2 cannibalistic nuts thrown in, but it just kind of shows how desperate they were. In the year of 1941, Andrei's father would be drafted into the Red Army and left for war, where he would end up being taken prisoner after he was wounded in duty. The Red Army, for those of us who don't know, was the Soviet army that had been created by the communist government but ended up being abandoned in 1946. It was believed that Andrei's mother may have been raped by soldiers because 2 years after his father had been drafted into the army, his mother would give birth to his younger sister, Tatiana. One source would say that there was a high probability that Andrei may have actually witnessed his mother being raped in the home, but there was no definitive answer on that. Roman, Andrei's father, would survive the war, but because he had been taken prisoner, he would be branded a traitor, and then consequently his own countrymen turned against him for quote-unquote allowing himself to be captured. Which, what the fuck is that? I hate that shit. Yeah, make fun of the guy who was forced to fight for his country and not killing himself when he was captured because he had a family back home. I chose to be in the Navy, and it was still hard and scary. I can't imagine what these people were going through, and it wasn't even their choice. Fuck that. Andrei's family was extremely poor, and it was said that at times his sister and him, and possibly his whole family, ate grass and leaves just to survive. Andrei's mother was said to be less than motherly. She was said to not only torment Andrei, but told him how he once had an older brother named Stefan that had been taken by the neighbors and cannibalized, which is absolutely horrific to tell a child, let alone your own son, about his own brother. What the fuck? We don't really have evidence that he had an older brother, so it's not really known if the mother just said that or if he really did have an older brother. Andrei would later say that he was actually 12 years old before he would first taste what bread was like. Because the family was so poor, Andrei was forced to sleep in the same bed as his mother, and this caused friction between Andrei and his mother because Andrei was apparently a chronic bedwetter for years. One source would say that it is believed that Andrei suffered from hydrocephalus at birth, which essentially is like water on the brain, and this caused him to quote-unquote have genital urinary tract problems throughout his life, and this could include his bedwetting that was said to have occurred well into his later adolescent years, and it could be why he suffered from impotence problems later. Before I knew that he had been born with hydrocephalus, I was thinking about the McDonald triad. I don't know if we had talked about it yet on here, but basically the McDonald triad, for those of you who don't know, is an older theory that kind of says that there are 3 indications in childhood that can allegedly predict whether someone will be a violent criminal or serial killer, and they are animal cruelty, setting fires or lighting objects on fire, and regular bedwetting. Now, J.M. McDonald was a psychiatrist, and he believed the animal cruelty portion could stem from children who were humiliated by other people for long periods of time or possibly abused by older authoritative adults. And the theory is, since the child cannot retaliate against the adult, they would take their anger and frustrations out on something weak and defenseless like an animal. The fire setting is similar in that it allows children to, according to an article in Healthline that goes over the triad in depth, quote, vent feelings of aggression and helplessness brought on by humiliations from adults who they feel they have no control over, end quote. This one in particular is apparently thought to be one of the earliest signs of the violent behavior in someone during adulthood. Finally, the bedwetting, and this is the bedwetting that will continue past the age of 5, and it lasts for months. McDonald theorized this could be linked to those same humiliation feelings. Then he speaks to the cycle that could be worsened if the child is humiliated or if they're embarrassed or feel that they're in trouble for wetting the bed, and thus the cycle continues. McDonald further said the bedwetting is usually linked to stress or anxiety. Now, studies have been done to test whether this theory was true or not, and during a 1966 study of 88 people that had been convicted of violent crimes or were murderers, this study would be found to have similar results, which corroborated McDonald's findings. A few other studies continued, but it was not every person that completed the triad. In 2018, a study found that only a few convicted people had just one or none of the triad, which led research to believe that the triad was actually more of a tool that could be used to indicate that the child had a troubling home environment, which could have led to some of their acts later on. While there are still shreds of truth to this day in the triad, it's not an exact science, hence the word theory. So I was going to say that I've heard and then read about how now they're more coming out with the thought that chronic bedwetting can be linked to like trauma in a child's life or things that cause them stress or emotional issues. Again, some people have a bedwetting problem and they have not been abused at all. So I think it's more of a whole picture and not just the one thing. It's still interesting that you can see these patterns of behavior in a lot of true crime, though. It definitely seems to be that children who have a horrific or fucked up childhood may copy the behaviors that they see or the trauma they endure. So again, be good to your children. I will leave some links to some of the articles that you can read further up on this stuff if you're interested, because it's pretty fascinating. Speaking to that stuff, I had wondered if Andrei's chronic bedwetting was from the trauma that he had been going through, or sort of the humiliation or abuse from his mother, or even the horrific events that he had witnessed, or even the period of time he was going through that triggered his bedwetting. Who knows? It could be a combination of all of it, really. Sadly for Andrei, his mother was less than pleased about the bedwetting and was said to have beaten him, when it would happen, which was often, probably continuing that cycle. It makes me really mad when I hear that parents get pissed about bedwetting or they humiliate or hurt a child because of it. How many of us have had the dream and almost peed the bed or did pee the bed when we were asleep? Or how many of us have been wasted and peed the bed in our party years? We're not perfect, yet some people expect their children to be able to control it. It's not like they're choosing to wet the bed. They're asleep, for fuck's sake. So Andrei's sister Tatiana would go on to say that their father Roman had treated his children well, a stark contrast to how Andrei was treated by their mother. It was said that Andrei, because he was constantly starving, actually led him to have a stomach that was swollen and extended, like we would often see in poor kids in like third world countries where their bellies are all puffed out. I've always wondered why their tummies do this, so I had to look it up. It turns out that it's fluid or water retention in the body in people who are malnourished because it causes their abdomens to expand like that. So because Andrei was suffering with that stomach distension and because his height was stunted from his malnourishment, he was bullied by his peers. He was also not dressed the greatest since his family was so poor. Andrei's teachers were said to have liked him because he was very smart and could absorb knowledge easily. He was known to read often, especially at home, and it turns out this was partly because he was nearsighted and wasn't able to see the blackboard at school, so it was a lot easier for him to read the information up close to his face. I don't know why this part made me so sad to think of a child who had gone through everything like this and then on top of it couldn't even see the board at school and needed to read things up close was just heartbreaking. We won't feel bad for him later on when he ends up being a monster. But again, I think it's alright to feel bad for the child versions of these horrific beings because they're innocent and they haven't done anything and they don't know better. During Andrei's teen years, he apparently became a huge follower of Stalin and was a believer in communism. Andrei would actually be the editor of the school newspaper during this time in his life, and then he graduated from high school in 1954. Although Andrei was interested in girls, he would struggle with impotence problems, which in turn would actually give him such insecurities that it led to some serious social awkwardness, especially around girls. However, there was one incident, and this would be his first and only real sexual experience growing up. He was said to be play fighting with one of his sister's friends, and they were like wrestling. When he had gotten her down to like the ground and she was trying to fight against him, all of a sudden Andrei had a spontaneous orgasm. One source went on to say that he, of course, was ridiculed even more for this. Andrei went on to apply to the Moscow State University, wanting to further his education, and although he did well on the exam, it just wasn't good enough to be accepted. So he was left trying to figure something else out. This is when Andrei would end up working as a laborer in Kirk for about 3 months. He really wanted to get into a technical or vocational school, and luckily for him, he would be able to study and learn to be a communications technician. At this time, Andrei actually had a girlfriend, but after about 18 months, this relationship would end. His impotence was said to have caused friction between the two, and it was ultimately either the entire reason or at least part of the reason for their breakup. Andrei would end up moving to Nizhny Tagil, which was in the Euro region, and here he could use his new tech school communication skills to get a job in a large-scale construction project that had been taking place there during the same time. He would also continue on his education at the same time, now with some correspondence courses in the Moscow Electrotechnical Institute of Communication. He would do this for 2 years until one day the Red Army came for him, where he was expected to do 3 years mandatory service. Andrei's post was at first on the border of Asia, and then he would be stationed in East Berlin, where he was using his skills to be a communication technician at what was said to be a KGB unit. Andrei's service was outstanding, and he would then receive an honorable discharge in 1960. Before Andrei had left the service, he would actually finish his full Soviet indoctrination when he joined what one source would say was like the Major League's Communist Party. After his service, Andrei would move back home to the collective farm where his parents were still working. He would then have, yet again, another failed relationship, this time with a divorced woman, and it only lasted about 3 months. Sadly, that woman had shared all of Andrei's penis problems with her lady friends, and they would ridicule and seemingly mock him for the problem. This caused Andrei to be extremely distraught and embarrassed that all of these women were talking behind his back that he actually had thoughts of suicide and went on to try and hang himself. His own mother and neighbor who had been with her found him and pulled him from the noose. After this, he ran away from his homeland thinking that no one could possibly want such a man, and probably from all of that humiliation. He ended up moving to a town called Rodionovo-Nesvatayevsky, which is a town close by Rostov, and this was still in the year of 1960. In this location, Andrei would work and become a telephone engineer. Apparently, his younger sister Tatiana had moved in with him and became a little concerned about his unsuccesses with women, so she introduced him to a woman that he would end up marrying in 1963. One source would say that the couple would marry after only a few weeks of dating. Her name was Feodosia Odnacheva, and although the couple didn't have what we would think is like a regular relationship, it was said to have been closer resembling like an arranged marriage. Feodosia was able to see past Andrei's impotence problems, and the couple was said to have figured out ways around this to make things work. One source would say that Andrei would just masturbate and then essentially help his wife to have an orgasm as well. Despite not having a quote-unquote regular sex life, the couple somehow conceived a baby. In 1965, they would go on to have a baby girl that they would name Ludmila. For anyone who knows, this must be a common Russian name, yeah? Because many of the cases that have involved Russia have had at least one person named Ludmila. I wonder what that name would be like comparable to over here. Anyways, the couple would go on to have another child in 1969, a boy that they named Yuri. While Andrei's family was growing, he was able to further his education even more by studying literature and philology as a distance learner at Rostov University. Philology, according to the Oxford Languages, is, quote, the branch of knowledge that deals with structure, historical development, and relationships of language or languages, end quote. Andrei would receive degrees in both subjects, where he had taken a year-long job as a sports activity director after, and then later, he would become a teacher. I guess Andrei wasn't really fit to be a teacher because he was kind of quiet and reserved, and because of this, the kids really didn't listen to him in class, and they would make fun of him. Andrei was working at what was called a mixed boarding school, meaning boys and girls. Here is where we start to get into some of his awfulness. Apparently, Andrei attempted to sneak into the girls' dorms, wanting to see them undress, but instead, he was shocked to find out that the boys were, of course, sneaking out of their own dorms to meet up with the girls for various sexual activities that Andrei would later state that he himself hadn't done even when he was 30. Andrei then had the thought that if the girls were ready for these types of sexual experiences, then why couldn't he join in? Gross. In May of 1973, so Andrei would be about 37 years old, he would try to come up with various ways to attempt the molestation of his students, which is just abhorrent. I hate when people in an authoritative position use that position to abuse those below them. The first time that Andrei would take advantage of a student was during a swimming lesson where he would grope a young student. The second time, he would actually lock one of his students in his classroom, and he would grope the girl and then proceed to beat her, one source said with a ruler. And again, Andrei would have a spontaneous orgasm during this incident. I fear a pattern is emerging. Andrei wouldn't receive any consequences for either of these incidents, and some speculate this is because of his ties to the Communist Party, which may have given him a free pass of sorts. Andrei was said to have systematically gained the trust of his boy and girl students for the purposes of trying to molest them, and one way that he did this, I guess, was by offering the students gum. It was said that gum was pretty rare for the poorer students back then. It got to the point where there were so many complaints about Andrei that he was told he could either resign or be fired. Of course, he would choose to resign, and because of this, he was able to get yet another teaching job not that far from his first. This time in Shakhty, which was about 47 miles north of Rostov. It would be in this area that Andrei would begin his murderous acts that he would later be known for. So for this part, I really struggled with how to go about talking about his victims. Look, guys, there are between like 50 to 56, maybe even higher victims for this piece of shit. I was torn between splitting this up or talking about every single victim because I want to show respect to the families of the victims. And of course, they all deserve to have their names and lives remembered. However, I think if I sat here and if I just listed every single murder and how it happened, that the second episode alone would be just naming boys and girls. And by the end, we would just be so depleted and depressed. So I think what I will do is just kind of talk about some of the murders that particularly stood out, because I think that we need to show the monster that he really was and his style of killing and what he did. I wish that I could make this one more about the victims, but sadly most of them are children, so most of them didn't have a lot of information besides a name and where the victim died. So what I'm going to do is link the Murderpedia page about Andrei's victim in the show notes for anyone who wants to see or read just the plethora of victims this sick fuck had. On November 13th, 1978, Andrei would commit his first murder of a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova. Andrei had spotted Lena walking home from the local ice rink. He was nice to Lena, where he proceeded to lure the young girl into the woods, grabbed her, covered her mouth, and then tried to rape the poor young girl. When Andrei still couldn't get himself aroused enough to even do that, he grabbed a small knife that he had on him where he would begin to stab the victim. While doing this action, he again had a spontaneous orgasm. Andrei would stab Lena 3 times in the stomach, strangled her, and then he fled. Her body would be found on Christmas Eve in 1978 underneath a small bridge. Unfortunately, in this case, the authorities would charge a man who had just been released for rape and murder named Alexander Kravchekno. Why was he being released after having raped and murdered someone? Good question. Although Alexander had a strong alibi for the time of the murder, I guess the authorities had put so much pressure on Alexander's wife that she went on to actually change her statement. Then Alexander would end up confessing to the crime under duress, which is why you should always immediately get a lawyer. Even if you're not guilty, get a lawyer. You don't want to get tricked into confessing or feeling like you have to. Originally, Alexander was sentenced to 15 years for the crime, which is crazy for the murder of a child, but all right. Then, because Lena's family was so convinced because of the police wanting to close this case that this was the man, that they ended up getting a retrial, and when he was found guilty the second time, he was sentenced to death. He would be executed in July of 1983 for a murder he didn't even commit. Now, in this particular case, since he was already a rapist and a murderer, I personally feel like he deserved it anyways, but it's unfortunate that at the same time, because of this, the real person responsible is free to do it again, which is exactly what happens in this case. Andrei would actually wait, as far as anyone knows, another 3 years before his next murder. There's always the possibility that there were more, but we just don't know. Andrei was now working as a supply clerk at a construction materials factory that was located in Rostov. This position actually allowed him to travel all over the Soviet Union, and his job was to negotiate supply contracts. One source would say that even though he was well overqualified for this position, it gave him access to people and victims in the areas he traveled to. September 3rd, 1981, Andrei would see a 17-year-old girl named Larissa while he was leaving the library. He struck up a conversation with Larissa about vodka and wanting to go drink in the woods and look at the nature nearby. Again, nothing good happens in the woods. When they were away from other people, Andrei grabbed Larissa and tried to rape her, but again, he couldn't. He then beat her and was even said to have stuffed dirt into her mouth to keep her from screaming loudly. He then did multiple things to this victim because he didn't have a knife on him. He would strangle her, try to use a stick to mutilate her, and even used his own teeth. At some point during the struggle and subsequent loss of consciousness, Andrei actually bit Larissa's nipple off her breast. Once the attack was finished and his victim was dead, he would cover Larissa with dirt and leaves and flee the area. Her body would be found the very next day. And this, my friends, is where I am going to leave you for part 1 of Andrei Chikatilo. A little taste into what his crimes and victims will be like. I'm telling you, this is one sick bastard and one of the worst you'll probably hear about. He is reminiscent of Albert Fish. I mean, you can definitely see that his childhood was not the best, and I was tempted here to point out that we hear of far worse childhood events or traumas from other monsters that would point to a much worse upbringing. But I recently heard something that has stuck with me and rings true in my own opinion. It was pointed out in a podcast that I listened to that it's unfair to compare someone's own trauma to that of others and always tell yourself that there are other people who have it worse. I do this to myself all the time. I had some gnarly stuff happen to me in my childhood, And when I was trying to be strong and pretend like it didn't affect me, which I still do to this day, I would tell myself that there were other people out there who had it worse. I was almost like telling myself that I don't get to feel the way that I feel because I should feel lucky that it wasn't worse. But that's not fair to ourselves, or if we say this about other people. People are all different, and some are capable of handling different levels of trauma differently. We don't get to decide what level of trauma is worse than others. Trauma is trauma. And it's all fucked up. It's all awful, and we shouldn't be belittling others' trauma because it doesn't seem as bad as someone else's. One person who, for example, is hit often as a child may not feel that the hitting was as bad as when they got screamed at or belittled by an adult, and yet in our own minds, we assume what's seemingly worse to us is also worse to them. I hope that it makes sense. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but what I'm basically saying is that everyone can handle different levels of things. And instead of judging someone for their trauma being quote unquote lighter than someone else's and feeling like they don't have the right to be as fucked up as they are or complain as much as they do or be affected by whatever, it's just not right. And I hope personally that I can start to think of my own trauma as valid and allow myself to be vulnerable enough to be okay with the fact that things bother me more than I allow myself to feel it. Anyways, I wanted to share that with you guys at some point, and apparently this was the point to do that. Weird. So next week, we will go into more depth and detail of Andrei Chikatilo's crimes and exactly what this monster was capable of and the outcome of his wrongdoings. I hope to see you guys come on back next week for part 2 here on The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help The Kill File and other true crime lovers find us. Also, check out the website at TheKillFile.com to suggest a case. Find our merch shop for fun Kill File gear, which you can also find at TheKillFile.printify.me and help support the podcast. Have a suggestion or want to share your own true crime stories? Email TheKillFilePodcast@gmail.com for a chance to get them read on the podcast. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue X, TikTok, and of course, you can subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. We are either listed as The Kill File or The Kill File Podcast. Come on back Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case here on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.